Just go to the next speaker, the Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Bill C-70, an act respecting countering foreign interference. My colleague, the member for Wellington Halton Hills, has done a good job in outlining some of the key measures provided for in this bill, which I will not repeat. Needless to say, on the whole, the measures and safeguards provided in the bill, including establishing new foreign interference-specific offences, as well as the establishment of a foreign influence registry, are welcome measures and, frankly, long overdue measures. And it is on that basis that Conservatives are committed to seeing this bill move through the legislative process expeditiously. And it's disappointing to see that in our efforts to do that, we were blocked as a result of the NDP, who seem to want to hold up this legislation. It's imperative that this bill move forward as quickly as possible, because officials have indicated that it may take up to 1 year to implement fully the bill upon it receiving royal assent. And we need to have these measures, we need to have these safeguards in place in time for the next election. Time is of the essence. And so while this bill, Madam Speaker, is welcome, I must say, why has it taken the government so long to introduce legislation to counter foreign interference? The Prime Minister for years has been warned by CSIS and other agencies about the threat of foreign interference, the fact that foreign interference is on the rise, and the fact that it threatens our sovereignty, democracy, and the safety and security of Canadians, particularly those in diaspora communities. The Prime Minister, moreover, has repeatedly and very specifically been briefed about the most significant foreign interference state threat, namely the Beijing-based communist regime. As far back as 2017, the Prime Minister's National Security and Intelligence Advisor briefed the Prime Minister that agents of Beijing were assisting Canadian candidates running for political offices. Madam Speaker, that was 8 years ago, and it has taken this government 8 long years to finally come around to introduce legislation to counter that type of foreign interference. In the 2019 election, 4 top Liberals closely connected to the Prime Minister received a CSIS briefing, a classified briefing, warning them that one of the Liberal candidates, the now member for Don Valley North, was assisted by Beijing in winning the Liberal nomination in Don Valley North. Now, one of those top Liberals who was briefed, who had the requisite security clearance, quite appropriately, immediately informed the Prime Minister of the contents of that brief. And what did the Prime Minister do with that information? Think about it. The Prime Minister is informed that there is CSIS intelligence that one of his candidates was being assisted by Beijing, presumably because Beijing viewed that individual as someone who would best advance Beijing's interests in Ottawa. Did the Prime Minister seek to inquire with CSIS to learn more about the situation and what intelligence they had? Did he ask any questions? No, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister turned a blind eye and allowed that individual to stand as a candidate and get elected to the House of Commons. In her first report, Madam Justice Hogg concluded that there was no evidence that the Prime Minister asked any questions or provided for any follow-up. But even worse than that, Madam Speaker, is the conclusion that Madam Justice Hogg drew that the Prime Minister decided against disallowing that candidate on the basis of direct electoral consequences. In other words, the Prime Minister put his political interests and the interests of the Liberal Party ahead of countering Beijing's interference in our elections and in our democracy. I would submit, Madam Speaker, that that is a damning indictment of the Prime Minister by Madam Justice Hogg. But there's more, because following the 2019 election, the Prime Minister was repeatedly briefed by CSIS that Beijing interfered in the 2019 and 2021 elections. And what did the Prime Minister do upon being briefed? Once again, the Prime Minister turned a blind eye, doing nothing, and worse than that, seeking to hide Beijing's interference, to cover it up, in contrast to the very advice that he had received from CSIS that the policy of the Government of Canada to counter foreign interference ought to be one based on sunlight and transparency, and that the government should make foreign interference activities known to the public. The policy of the Prime Minister, in contrast, was a policy of cover-up. And, Madam Speaker, the degree of interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections ought not be minimized, as the Prime Minister has repeatedly attempted to do. Don't take my word for it. Take the words of Madam Justice Hogg in her first report from the Foreign Interference Inquiry. She concluded unequivocally that there was interference in the last two federal elections, and that such interference was serious. Serious insofar as it, quote, diminished the ability of some voters to cast an informed vote. Although foreign interference did not change the overall result of the election, she did note that it may have impacted the results in certain ridings, and that this interference had a negative impact on the broader electoral ecosystem. Those are very concerning findings, and the fact that the Prime Minister had been repeatedly briefed before the 2019 election, after the 2019 election, after the 2021 election, and took no action, downplayed Beijing's interference after it was revealed, thanks to reports from the Globe and Mail and Global News, demonstrates that this Prime Minister bears some level of responsibility for Beijing's attack on our democracy in the last two federal elections. And that brings us back to the timing of this bill. Why now? There is one reason, and one reason only, why these Liberals have finally seen fit to introduce legislation to counter foreign interference, and that is because the Prime Minister got caught turning a blind eye to Beijing's interference and attempting to cover it up. Had he not been caught, this legislation would have never seen the light of day. That is demonstrated by the fact that this bill was introduced on the first sitting day following the issuance of Madam Justice Hogg's report. The Liberals knew that the report was going to be incredibly damaging to the government, which it most certainly was, and this was their way of providing for themselves political cover. And so, yes, while this bill is welcome, this government deserves absolutely no credit for introducing a bill that, frankly, they have introduced having been dragged kicking and screaming after the Prime Minister turned a blind eye to Beijing's interference in our elections. Under this Prime Minister's watch, foreign interference has increased, and it is part of the sad record of a failed Prime Minister.